Right, let's get started. Good evening everyone and welcome to the North West Young Fabians event as part of Labour Connected. Delighted to be hosting this event. My name is Matthew Subbart. I'm the current chair of North West Young Fabians and I'm currently studying at Manchester University. I'm originally from Workington, where I was born and raised and where I proudly spent 2 years as a Labour councillor. The North West Young Fabians are delighted to be hosting this event as we are also desperately wanting Labour to win in the future. We want to be part of the movement that helps Labour regain and rebuild trust in areas such as Workington, Barrow-in-Furness, Bolsover, Burnley, Bolton, and other areas in what is known as the Red Wall. Without further ado, I'll introduce the panel. We are joined by Professor Kevin Morgan from the University of Manchester, Sue Hayman, former MP for Workington and now a member of the House of Lords. We'll be soon joined by Shadow Education Secretary Kate Green, who is running slightly late. Kate is also the MP for Stretford and Urmston. Each of the panel will have around 10 minutes to speak about how they believe Labour can rebuild and regain the trust of those that we lost at the last election. The chat function is disabled as this is a Zoom webinar. However, please submit as many, welcome Kate, as many questions as you like to the question and answer function, which is open below. To start the debate, I would like to introduce Professor Kevin Morgan. Kevin, would you like to speak?
Okay, thank you, Matt. And yes, I'm basically a historian, so in the few minutes I've got, what I shall probably try and do is give a bit more of a historical perspective on, I suppose, this current predicament that we're talking about this evening, and maybe leave it to Sue and Kate, who are going to find the ways out for us. But just to try and get a bit of historical perspective, because I think sometimes that's been a little bit absent in some of the immediate responses to the defeat last December, which obviously, in a sense, took everybody aback. It was in many ways a disastrous defeat. But I think we also sometimes need to work a bit harder at disentangling longer term issues from more immediate and contingent ones. So that's what I will try to do. Because I think if you do step back just a little, in a way the predicament looks not quite so bleak as we sometimes think, but in a way it's politically even more challenging. And when I say not quite so bleak, I was thinking, I had a look this morning at the famous article on Labour's lost millions, which Eric Hobsbawm wrote after the truly catastrophic defeat of 1983, which, as you know, there's another 14 years before Labour recovers from that and is back in office. And Hobsbawm writes in 83 that there isn't a glimmer of comfort for Labour anywhere in those results, because he's describing it's an ageing electorate, a declining social constituency, and Labour is doing worst of all among first-time voters in 83. And so in a way, we're talking about the Red Wall today, so I'm not going to, obviously that's the focus because that's where the results were worst. But if we do step back a little, the position isn't as bleak as in 83. I suppose some of those, those first-time Tory voters in 83, in a sense, they're a bit younger than me, now in their mid to late 50s. In a way, they've probably been part of the problem ever since, some of that sort of electoral demographic. But at the same time, Labour has had this support among younger voters that is going to be crucial to any sort of lasting solution. If those older voters are part of the problem we're confronting, the younger voters must be part of the solution. So that's obviously challenging in terms of, what we're doing in terms of the rebuilding the Red Wall. We've got to make sure that we don't rebuild the wall in one place and find it's falling down somewhere else, because those young voters are so crucial to Labour's future, and the voters in the city and so on. So that makes it so politically challenging. But I also think, Hobsbawm's, in 83, he's talking about Labour's vote has been declining, and he's tracing off basically 30 years since the 1950s. And in a way, you can do that in the context of the red wall seats. That is definitely also the case. So that actually it wasn't just about the 2019 election. You can, places like the Potteries is one of the areas that I know best, and you can see great chunks out of the Labour vote being knocked out at virtually every election since Blair was elected in 97. So this is something that has quite deep roots. But at the same time, when I say it's not quite so bleak, it's only 3 years ago since that Labour, even in those seats, achieved actually almost the only sort of counter movement that you've had in some of those seats. You can just look at the figures, and it's very clear. And that's certainly true, say, of the 3 seats in Stoke-on-Trent. So I think there's 2 big challenges for Labour. One is that it represents a deeply fragmented coalition, and as there's this challenge of rebuilding the wall in one place without it falling down in another, or we don't want to go for a sort of Boris Johnson type whack-a-mole where we hit something on the head in one place, but at the same time we end up with all those sorts of problems about young people's disengagement from politics. People don't want to join political parties that say, I've been teaching the same sort of courses for 20 odd years, was teaching about 10 years ago. So there's some things that we need to hold on to as well. And I think there's also, in doing that, as I say, we've had 2 elections rather in the last 3 years. And I think there's a challenge in terms of the politics of the Labour Party. There's so many things we approach through the prism of faction. And so actually, which are you going to choose, 2017 election or 2019 election? And that might depend on where you're standing in the Labour Party. And actually, this is our most recent history. We need to engage with the lessons of both of those. So yes, I'll try and avoid addressing the issue of rebuilding the red wall as just a sort of verdict on the last election. And I would just, obviously haven't got much time, I just make 2 or 3 points then of a very broad generic type that I would make in sort of reflecting on Labour's history, I suppose, not just since the 1990s, but maybe since the 1940s. The first is that I think Labour has to avoid getting dragged into the culture wars that have become synonymous with Brexit, and which the Tories see as their strongest territory. And in a sense, that is an issue, whether it's Keir Starmer or Jeremy Corbyn, it's the same sort of issue. In a way, why did Labour sort of confound many people's expectations in 2017? In a sense, Corbyn, by turning the election onto more of an issue of austerity rather than Brexit, did manage to get onto that sort of traditional Labour territory, let's evoke the spirit of 1945 and so on, and that actually did produce results that nobody anticipated. I'm in a department full of cephologists and electoral experts. None saw that coming in 3 years ago, 2017. So we need to draw from that. I think it has to be a sort of positive vision rather than just waiting for the Tories to implode, or through the inherent, there's so many problems with the current government and so on. But I think if you think back to whether you think of Attlee, you think of Wilson in the 60s, you think of Blair, very different sorts of projects, but the one thing that they all had in common was there was a sort of positive vision, a sense of seizing the political initiative, and the sense that if you're going to make those connections between traditional Labour voters in the red wall seats, younger voters in the cities and so on, it has to be through some sort of positive vision. And in a sense, there has to be that sense of an alternative. And I think one of the, in 2017, the people looked at the manifesto, they didn't necessarily know that much about what was in it, but there was this sense there was a difference between voting Labour and Conservative. I think probably Labour's mistake in the last election was, if 3 good policies get you 1,000 voters, give 33 voters and you'll get 1 million voters, and it obviously didn't happen. But that sense of a distinct alternative. And I would also, maybe just as a final point, the slogan of new leadership about at the moment. I would say in terms of the way that Labour thinks about the whole issue of leadership, I would say to get away from the fixation on the figure of the leader. Huge problem with Corbyn, because Corbyn, you know, there were a number of sort of contingent factors in the last election, like Brexit. Corbyn was certainly one of them. When Corbyn says, you know, I'm a sort of Marmite type figure, you could, well, Thatcher was a Marmite figure. Thatcher's strength was that she supporters liked her, and her, you know, her Labour opponents didn't like her. Corbyn's problem was that half of his own supporters didn't like him. But I think but he also succeeded in mobilising, energising younger voters. Anybody could see that. And I think that maybe that projection on the figure of the leader is a problem. I don't know about Keir Starmer. I think one of the most successful, probably the most successful Labour leader would be Attlee. And Attlee didn't have a presidential style, wasn't particularly charismatic, but Attlee did manage to hold together the sort of very broad coalition of the Labour movement and a cabinet of strong personalities at that time. And so actually the fact that in some ways he was the Labour leader that put himself forward least as part of a sort of collective appeal was, I think, crucially important. And so if you think about this issue of the fragmented coalition, there are people within the shadow cabinet now who can probably speak with greater authenticity to voters in these red wall seats than I think, whether he wants to or not, Keir Starmer is ever going to be able to. But then the same goes in terms of, you know, I think it's tragic that the Tories, you know, on all sorts of issues of diversity in terms of leadership are likely to break all the precedents before Labour does. But Labour also needs to have voices that can actually speak to different parts of this fragmented coalition. So actually, I think if you look at those, you know, when things have worked for Labour in the past, which isn't as often as we would have liked, you can actually see that also as being one of the strengths. And I suppose the very final point, I suppose, that the question of how far do you move into that sort of blue Labour territory? How far do we try and compete on that territory with which the Tories are more comfortable? And personally, I mean, I think that could take us in some rather ugly directions in itself, but I think could also be, if we reflect on the longer experience, like all the hopes invested in New Labour, and then why are these red wall seats and other seats losing such significant levels of Labour support successively in 2001, 2005, 2010, you can see the sort of the disillusionment disaffection that can build in. So I would say, I would end with I would say you need a positive message. I wouldn't go in that direction. The one thing that Blair and Corbyn had in common was the slogan, the many, not the few. And actually, I think that as a sort of sense, well, you've got to flesh that out a bit, obviously, but in terms of as a sort of a notion whereby you can make the connections between these disparate constituencies, I think something along those lines is what I would go for.
Thank you, Kevin, for that. I'm now going to introduce Sue Hayman, former MP for Workington and a new member of the House of Lords. Sue is going to speak about her experience at being obviously the former MP for Workington, what it was like on the campaign trail, and how she believes Labour can rebuild in the future. Go ahead, Sue.
That's great. Thank you, Matthew. And also, can I just say thank you for your support during the election? You and many other young people gave me a lot of support, which is much appreciated. I think losing my seat in Workington, I think, was probably very similar to a number of the other red wall seats. And I think there are three particular reasons why we lost last December. One was Jeremy Corbyn, two was Brexit, and the third were the reasons behind Brexit, why people voted for Brexit in the first place. So I'll start with Jeremy. Now, Kevin talked about the leader and do we need to have, what is the importance of the leader? Do we need to move away from that kind of personality trait of the leader on the doorstep? I think it's actually very difficult to do that now. I think society, the way the media and social media portray any political leader is actually what people on the doorstep believe to be true. Most people aren't particularly nerdy about politics. They don't take huge interest, particularly the older generation in constituencies like Workington. So they just see what they're given, and that's what they believe. And one of the big problems we had in Workington is that, like many, many white working class constituencies, Workington is actually the whitest constituency in England. It's Conservative with a small c. And being Conservative with a small c means that they really value the military. They really value the monarchy. They have very traditional values. And the media portrayal of Jeremy meant that he came across as unsupportive of the values that they had. With lots of stories about how he supported the IRA, how he supported Hamas. Whether these, you know them to be true or not, isn't an issue when you've voted in the paper and you are just an ordinary voter. So, and the other problem we had is that he was seen to be a weak leader, not a strong leader. He wasn't seen to be decisive on the doorstep. People didn't have a picture of him as someone who could lead the country. So when people would say to me on the doorstep things that were not particularly nice about Jeremy, and I would say, well, look, I know him, you don't, and have a chat with him, and what do you think about Boris? They didn't mind that Boris had not always been a particularly decent person, and that he had issues around his private life and so on, because they saw him as a personality and someone who could lead. And that's what they were looking for, which was terribly frustrating, on the doorstep. So what we need to do, I think, from the perspective of the leader, is it's really important that any leader we have is seen as strong, is seen as competent and confident, and is seen as someone who is capable of leading the country and being a prime minister. They on the doorstep, people believe that Jeremy would be dangerous as a prime minister, which of course is ridiculous, but that was the belief that they had been fed by the media, and not just by the media. I could tell walking down the street when that street had been canvassed by the Conservatives, because every door said exactly the same thing. So you'd walk down one street and it was, I can't vote for Corbyn, he's got funny eyes. Really bizarre things. And the fact that every household said it. So the Conservatives had a definite tactic to undermine our leader. And we have to be aware of that in future. Interestingly enough, when I said to people, who do you see, if there was a different leader, who would you see? Keir Starmer was the name that came forward all the time, because they saw him as a steady, safe, intelligent pair of hands. And that's what people were looking for. The second thing is Brexit. I think any constituency that voted Brexit in high numbers like mine did, any constituency that voted Brexit over 60% had a problem in 2019 that they didn't have in 2017. Because in 2017, people didn't believe that the Labour Party had frustrated Brexit and was trying to undo Brexit. By 2019, they did. So any member of parliament like me, who had not wholeheartedly supported no deal, because by this stage, people had convinced themselves that the Brexit they'd voted for was no deal. And that was all that counted. So when I tried to explain things on the doorstep, they didn't care. They weren't interested. They just wanted out, and we want out now. And we were seen to be frustrating that process. I was going against the will of my constituents. I did not deserve to continue to be the member of parliament. It didn't matter how good I was. I actually had one woman crying on the doorstep saying, you have been a brilliant MP, Sue, but I cannot vote for you because we have to get Brexit done. And that came up. That snappy slogan, get Brexit done, worked brilliantly in Workington. It came up constantly. And the trouble is that our messaging was far too complicated. We were trying to do too much. And the messaging, I think, got more complex as the election went on, as we tried to come up with more policies that we thought people would connect with. But at that point, people they weren't interested anymore, unlike in 2017. They just wanted to get Brexit done. And even people who'd voted Remain told me that they were going to vote Tory, to get Brexit done because we couldn't carry on like this as a country any longer. Which brings me to the longer term issues. Again, Kevin talked about this, which is the reasons why Brexit happened in the first place. And I think that a lot of the reasons behind that are also to do with why we've then lost that support. I think it's all connected. Working class northern seats in particular felt ignored and forgotten by the Labour Party. They felt that they hadn't benefited from the Blair governments in the way that other areas of the country had. They saw the South East and London getting richer and richer while they got poorer and poorer. Our infrastructure was constantly undermined, whether that's poorer train services, poorer roads, poorer connectivity, all the time when money was given out. If you look at Cumbria, for example, the government would say we've given money to Cumbria. It was always east of Penrith and into the Pennines, never into the former industrial areas. So we lost our steelworks, we lost our mining industry, and the only industry that we had left was nuclear. And with Jeremy Corbyn as leader, nobody locally believed that Labour would invest in the nuclear industry, no matter what our policies were. They also believed that there were problems with immigration. And again, I think this is behind Brexit as well. And again, it's an area with very, very small amount of immigration. And I think, again, there's a lack of understanding in areas where you have very diverse communities. You don't get the same kind of statements you get on the doorstep in a place that doesn't have that, that diversity. Labour was seen, this is going back way beyond, this is going back to when I stood in 2015 and when I was knocking on council doors before that. We were seen as soft on immigration. Immigration was seen as out of hand. Again, it comes to how the media speaks to local people. And we need to find how we can actually speak to people so that we get across the truth, what our policies are, beyond what the media are saying. Someone said to me on the doorstep when I was canvassing for Remain, why are you voting for Remain? And I explained. And they said, but I have to vote for Brexit. And I said, why? And they said, well, it can't get any worse than it is now, and we have to try something different. And that disconnect had been growing for absolute decades. And if you look at West Cumbria, you have two constituencies, Copeland and Workington. Copeland Council, Labour lost control of that a number of years ago. After that, the Member of Parliament went at a by-election. The May before the general election, 2019, Labour lost control of Allerdale Council, which is where Workington is. And then we lost the MP. This is something that we should have seen coming years before. But we haven't properly listened or understood what people in those traditional white working class areas whose industry and manufacturing has collapsed, about how their huge loss of pride and feeling of abandonment has caused us problems. They expect to be abandoned by the Conservative Party. They don't expect to be abandoned by Labour. And I think this is what we have to work on now as a party. How do we reconnect? How do we talk to people so that they genuinely believe that we're listening and we want to help? Because that's I think, the barrier that we have to overcome. So the more that Keir, the Shadow Cabinet, can get out and about and actually talk, not just to ordinary voters, but to members, and to talk to members about how we actually reconnect with those lost voters, I think is incredibly important. Otherwise, although they told me they'd only lent their vote to the Tories for this election, I'm not sure they'll come back. I think we have a long-term problem that we have to reconnect with. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks for everything that you did as my MP for the years I was living in Workington. So thanks for all you did. You were a fantastic MP. We're now going to move on to the Shadow Education Secretary, Kate Green, who's also the MP for Stretford and Ermston. Kate, thanks for joining us. If you could give your perspective as a current member of Keir's shadow cabinet. That would be fantastic. We look forward to hear what you've got to say.
Well, thank you very much. And I agree with where Sue finished. We are in real danger, not just of having lost these red wall seats, but of not winning them back. And make no mistake, the Conservatives will work very hard to hang on to them. They will pour attention and resource into them in a very calculated way. And that will be done with no acknowledgement that over the last 10 years, of course, they have been making people's lives more miserable, more impoverished, less well supported by good public services. And that when they turn up to say that here they are investing in infrastructure or investing in the education system or investing in the NHS, there will be no admission whatsoever about the damage that 10 years of austerity have done. What will be seen is a Johnson-led Conservative government putting these constituencies first, and they will be extremely ruthless and focused, I think, about directing their political and expenditure priorities to hold on to those gains. And I also agree with Sue that leadership is going to be really important, that if you look at insofar as people have anything much favourable to say about Labour at the moment, and really the best they have to say on the whole is that they're not paying us too much attention and the jury's kind of out, but they do like the leader. They do talk about Keir as somebody who looks prime ministerial, who seems a good, competent, safe pair of hands. So I think I'm much more with Sue, to be honest, than Kevin on this issue of leadership. I think it is our starting point, and it is really, really crucial for returning to being a party that looks like a credible future party of government. Without that being in place, I think nothing else will ever really quite resonate with the electorate. I also want to agree very strongly with this need to engage with voters where they are, what their priorities, what their feelings, what their concerns and needs now are. And that, of course, goes to the voters in the red wall seats, the ones seen as rock-solid Labour voters who now are not, or perhaps those who've not voted at all for many, many years. But let's not assume that there are now other groups of voters that we can take for granted. I don't think we can take the youth vote for granted. I don't think we can take the inner city Asian vote for granted. I think we've got to attend to all constituencies of our vote. I don't mean parliamentary constituencies, all the different components and elements of our vote. And that is an enormous challenge for us, actually, as a party to hold, I think it was Kevin was saying, this immensely varied coalition into a space where it feels that Labour has something to offer every single element of that. So that's sort of the challenge of who we are, how we're perceived, what we stand for. But I just wanted to touch very briefly on the other challenge that I think we faced in some, not all the red wall seats, but in some, and that was a total collapse of party organisation. We'd not done any canvassing, any data gathering, any voter contact, any voter ID in years and years and years. There were seats in parts of the northeast of England, for example, where the voter contact rate was single figures, was below 5%. There were seats where we had just never knocked on doors. Nobody knew who we were. And Sue is right to say that we had early warning signs of how some of that was affecting us as we began to lose councillors and councils. But what we then found was that by the time we became aware of this massive disconnect, not just in what we were saying, but the fact that we weren't even going around to talk to them, the form of contact with voters had also significantly moved on. And the Tories were extremely effective. They weren't particularly good at knocking on doors either. They've never had the number of people, the membership that we, particularly since Jeremy became leader, we had a very substantial number of members some of whom were prepared to go out and knock on doors. In my own constituency, a lot of the new members became very enthused in the 2017 and 2019 general elections and turned out to be very good and committed campaigners. But by the time that we had sort of built up this army of campaigners, and the Tories really couldn't match that and have not been able to match that for a long, long time with their ageing, shrinking party, they had discovered and were exploiting other forms of voter contact, voter communication, which we had done quite well in 2017, but had really dropped the ball by 2019, and we were being massively outstripped by the new ways of messaging and reaching out. And when Sue says, I thought it was so interesting, Sue, you said this, that you could tell when the Tories had been down a particular street. What I used to think was not that they'd been down the street, because we never saw them. I assumed that some very clever Facebook targeting had gone on that week. You were quite right, it was the same message on every doorstep. It was a script. They'd been given it and they were parroting it, reading it back to us. But I don't think, certainly in Stretford and Ermston, they'd been knocking on that many doors. I think they'd been doing it very, very cleverly and effectively, using different media platforms, different forms of communication. And if we're thinking about the wide range of voter communities that we now need to be able to reach out to, we mustn't underestimate or underinvest in all the different forms of voter outreach and voter communication channels that we are going to need to understand and make sure we make the most of. The final thing I just want to say, it's all a bit gloomy, isn't it? Is that this is one of the most corrupt governments I can remember in my, possibly the most corrupt government actually I can think of in my entire life. Johnson has we can see it today as we're debating the Internal Markets Bill, this utter contempt for the rule of law, utter contempt for parliamentary democracy, the way in which he prorogued Parliament to suit his own political needs, a rot that began under Cameron with fixing of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, that didn't really work out quite as it was expected, but nonetheless, the attempt to reduce the number of parliamentary constituencies also hasn't quite worked out as expected, but nonetheless, boundaries will be fixed. Fixed as in the sense of cooked up, I mean. The packing of statutory instrument committees to favour government numbers, even although they did not have a majority between 2010 and 2015. The repeated disregard for, the contempt for institutions of our democracy, I think is an extremely concerning indication of the broader corruption that you see in the way in which, in scratching the backs of their rich mates, they've massively failed and let down the country when it comes to the COVID emergency. But that is also space we can exploit. Because what they have done, and Sue is so right to talk about pride in Britain and how we completely missed that in really going back over many, many years. What the Tories are now doing is badly, badly letting down Britain. And that also seems to me to be space that we need to be in and to exploit. Because, you know, the old truism that oppositions don't win, governments lose elections, I think that's massively oversimplified. But there is plenty to attack in the way that this arrogant government actually behaves and the impact it has on people's lives in constituencies like Workington, in constituencies like Stretford and Ermston, in constituencies like Lewisham or Islington or Birmingham Ladywood or Birmingham Yardley or Devon and Cornwall, wherever it is. And we need to be ruthlessly focused now on talking about the power of what the Tories are doing and the way it is impacting on people's lives. We have to go out and talk about the transformational power of government to improve people's lives, but we also have the evidence of the harm that bad government is doing to them, their families and their communities, and we mustn't be squeamish about pointing that out. So I think it's an interesting and energising time for the Labour movement. So it's such a fight now that we all have to get stuck in and really fight it as a fight to the end. But my final comment really would be that I am, in the privacy of this meeting, anxious about next May, because if we don't start to look like we're coming back 8 months from now in the local, the regional mayoral, the police and crime commissioner, the Welsh and Scottish elections, and some of those elections are really, really tough, I think we make the very steep mountain that we have to climb even steeper. And so there's not much time for hanging around. The time for effective campaigning, effective organisation, effective messaging and effective leadership is right now.
Thank you, Kate, for that perspective. We are now going to move on to the question and answer session. Thanks to everyone that submitted questions. I've been absolutely overwhelmed with questions from far and wide in the country. So I'll do my best to get the panel to answer as many as them as possible. If the panelists could keep their answers to about 1.5 minutes, that would be brilliant, and then we can get through as many questions as possible. That'd be great. First question is from Thomas, and I'd like Kevin to answer this first, given what he speaking about regarding Labour's 33 policies, as he referred to. So the question from Thomas is as follows. Tories' last election results have saw them use short, snappy slogans such as "Get Brexit Done" and "Strong and Stable Leadership." Is it time that Labour adopts a similar approach rather than the long and lengthy policy offer of the last 2 elections?
In a way, yes, but I would separate the 2 elections. In a sense, Gerald Kaufman, Labour politician, famously referred to Labour's election manifesto in '83 as the longest suicide note in history. And I think it wasn't the policies, it was the length and the amount of them, in a sense, meant a diminished credibility, basically. It didn't carry conviction. And that certainly was the case in the last election, compounded by certain things, almost seemed to be as if they're being, thought up on the spot. But 2017, because I think, again, there's this, the 2 elections have happened in the last 3 years. And so we've got to somehow, we need to have a sense of what went right, because even in even in Workington and so on, Labour's recovering several percentage points, which it hasn't done for years. And so one needs to figure out what went right then. And I think a lot of people said it wasn't so much Corbyn, though Corbyn with a certain section of the electorate, but the manifesto. And it had a much greater clarity, and you could identify with a sense of a distinct alternative, which was basically, anti-austerity, some limited public ownership and so on. So I think if that was a successful manifesto, it does mean to go that way rather than the 29 approach, which was long and convoluted and so on.
Thank you, Kevin. Kate, would you like to come in on that question? So I'll give you the opportunity to after Kate.
Yeah, I very much agree with Kevin. The 2019 manifesto was really not only too long, and most of us liked almost all of the individual policies, but it felt undeliverable. It felt undeliverable to me, and I don't mean by that it wasn't costed. A lot of it was carefully costed, or as carefully as you can in opposition, but it just wasn't doable. You couldn't have done all of that in a 5-year parliament. I used to look at it and think, how on earth are we going to put all of that in place? The civil service will collapse within itself, and there just isn't the capacity to deliver all of that. And contrast that with 1997, when we had 5 early pledges and very high level and indistinct, actually, in terms of what we were going to do in policy terms, they actually were. So I think we had far too much in the 2019 manifesto, and then we compounded it by adding bits to it as we went along. Well, here's the manifesto, it's absolutely fabulous, and here's another 4 things we're going to do this week that none of us was expecting. And you would be out on a doorstep and you'd suddenly be told that we were offering free broadband, or we were offering to correct the injustice against the WASPy women. Very, very worthy policies, but they turned up, it seemed every few days here was a bit more. It just did not feel credible. And I think a much more focused and sharper offer to the electorate, which feels more credible and believable and doable, is really important. I also think if you want to introduce really brave, groundbreaking and radical policies, many of which we did in the 19 manifesto, many of which we all liked, you need to roll the pitch. And that doesn't start during the election campaign, it starts a long way back.
Thank you, Kate. So,
yeah, no, I mean, you need a kind of a bit of both, really. You need those kind of sharp, clear messages that get across to people very, very easily, that people can grab hold of. Like the pledge card, and like the for the many, not the few, things that because it really did make a difference. Get Brexit done. Because it became the slogan of the election in Workington, and I'm sure in other places as well. And we didn't have anything that, if you said to somebody, well, what are Labour Party's policies, they wouldn't have been able to tell you, because it got much, much too complicated. Having said that, obviously the manifesto in 2017 was a really good manifesto. Much of the 2019 manifesto was based on that. So there's lots of really good stuff in it, but it just got too much and too heavy. And in a way, you need a really sharp, focused manifesto with some good, snappy headliners, if you like. But I still believe that it should be underpinned by good, thought-out, detailed policy that people who are particularly interested in can go and have a look and find out what that actually means. So you're not just coming up with slogans, you've got the underpinning underneath it.
Sorry, Matt, if I can just come in just on one, without going to the depths of history, but Labour's manifesto in 45, Let Us Face the Future, was a fantastic document because it was radical, but at the same time, in terms of what Kate was saying, it seemed totally achievable and in fact was substantially achieved within 3 years. So, you know, that would almost be a model, which I don't think has lost its relevance now.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. The trouble is with the way media and social media is, you've got to have the snappiness at the top as well.
Thanks, Sue, and thanks, Kevin, for those answers. My next question is from Peter, who asks, can Labour rebuild its red wall without losing its cities? Kate, I'm going to ask you to answer that first.
Well, I think it can actually, and this was something that I think Lisa Nandy was trying to talk about during her leadership campaign, that there are common threads that bring our cities, our red wall seats, our wide constituencies of voters into shared space, shared values, shared concerns. And I would take the education brief as a really good example of this, because I mean, I think it's an easier brief than some for engaging with the voters that we lost or the voters that we need to retain. Everyone everywhere wants the best for their kids. Everybody is aspirational for their children. You know, they want them to do well. They want them to be happy, to have a good job, to be able to have a good quality of life. And so I think finding the sort of emotional and values-based needs, the things that people care about, that resonate in every community, and having conversations about those things with voters is a very good place to start. Instead of which, I think we do have a bit of a tendency to go and tell the voters what we think is important to them. And that not only, I think, means that we miss out on what actually matters to quite a lot of them, but we may only be talking to one sector or one segment of our voter base. So I think there is space to identify some common threads and themes, some human aspirations and priorities that would bring together a coalition of urban and rural, red wall and inner city. But we need to do that by starting with where we find that those voters currently are, what are their concerns and preoccupations, and not by trying to tell them that these are the things that we think matter to them.
Thank you, Kate. Sue, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, Kate's absolutely right. I think one of the problems that we've had is that a lot of our towns, particularly in pre-industrial areas, you know, areas where they've lost their steelworks or mines or whatever, just felt that the cities were getting everything and they weren't getting anything. So there's become a disconnect. There's always been a disconnect to a certain extent between rural and urban, but I think there's become a much broader disconnect between those smaller towns, a lot of them are coastal towns, and the big cities. And it's not just to do with London and the southeast and the wealth, but it's also that when money is pumped out regionally, it tends to be pumped into the cities, and then they're expected to dish it out. But whether that's true or not, the perception in those towns is that they kind of get left behind and get more and more left behind. So I think a lot of what we can do as a party is try to heal that disconnect, if you like, because as Kate says, you know, we all have the same desires for our children to do well, for people to be well educated, for good housing, for good health services. So there's more in common politically than there isn't. So it's how do you bring that disconnect? How do you bridge that?
Thanks, Sue. Kevin, would you like to speak?
Yeah, I mean, because I completely agree with what Kate and also what Sue is saying. So, and if we don't think we can do that, it's almost like we might as well give up now. If we can't, if there aren't those themes that connect, so something like education absolutely would be, you know, that a traditional Labour area of policy and the aspirations people have and will be common to those different areas. I do also think there is a, you know, because we talked a little bit, or bringing in issues like issues of, I suppose, sense of nationhood, talked about the army, talked about issues of immigration. I think there are also quite worrying things going on at the moment, because there can be a sort of demonization of the city, which can be in quite racialized forms, that anybody who has moved to a certain extent through family and so on is actually has one foot in different places, encounters this. And so I think there is a sort of a territory which the Conservatives, I mean, Kate, you were saying about how cynically they will work this territory, and there are certain themes that will play more to them than to us. And so I think the challenge is actually, it's precisely on those issues of employment, opportunity, education, in such ways as we counter that with what you might say is a, you know, traditional Labour values, which are common to those different constituencies.
Thanks, Kevin, for that. My next question is from a local councillor named Marcus. Marcus asks, what role can Labour and local government play in rebuilding the Red Wall? And what advice would the panel give to opposition district councillors like me? Marcus from Allerdale. Sue, if you could answer that first, that would be great.
Yes, I think I know which Marcus that is. So hello, Marcus. No, I mean, he's absolutely right. And I think it's absolutely critical, because it's very difficult to rebuild the Red Wall at that Member of Parliament level if you don't have councillors and members and supporters and activists and people who are already demonstrating to the electorate what it means to have Labour in charge, what it means to have a Labour councillor, you know, how we can help and support communities locally. And for me, you always build up from the bottom. And councillors will play an absolutely crucial role in this. I mentioned earlier that the first sign for us, certainly in West Cumbria, that things were going badly wrong was when we started losing those councillors, because they are the closest people that we have to their local communities, whether that's at parish level, borough level, whether it's at county council level, or whether you're a unitary. Your councillors, also very important as a Member of Parliament, I would talk to my councillors regularly and meet very, very regularly with local council, because they see local people and they may tell them things that they're not going to tell you at the Member of Parliament. So to me, it's incredibly important. They're the backbone of our movement, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes, Sue, and I actually couldn't agree more. Kate, if you could come in on that'd be great.
Yes, I completely agree. And I'm in the complete opposite situation from Sue, in that Trafford, where I've been the MP since 2010, we've actually taken back the council from the Tories after 14 years, for a long time anyway, of Conservative rule. And one of the things I'd say was that was a long job. It didn't happen overnight. It really took us about 6 years from identifying a strategy to do it, to actually, first of all, getting them to no overall control, and we were able to take power in a minority council, and then to winning outright control last year. And partly it was exploiting their mistakes. You know, when they've been in power for a long time, things weren't going so well, and they were there to take the blame. So we saw the mirror image, I think, of some of what had happened to some of our Labour councils up and down the country in Trafford. And that gives us some hope, I think, that politics is not forever. You know, things do swing, pendulums do swing. But you need to be persistent, you need to be determined, you need to accept that there will be some setbacks, but you've got to have a clear goal that you are going to win that council back, and a plan for how you're going to do it and execute that plan. And for that, you need people. You need committed activists, and committed activists need hope. They need to believe that they're involved in a winning project. And that's some of that, I think, does come from how the party is being perceived and behaving nationally, even if the election is being fought for for power locally. And so I think an upbeat, confident national party is an important part of both mobilising our own activists, but also giving a sense of believability to the electorate.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Too many Zoom routines. Kevin, would you like to come in on that?
Well, only very briefly, because I'd only make the one sort of historian's point that I think actually looking back at the longer term issues in terms of with these constituencies, the whole, the scope, the pressures that local governments have been under, I think have been a contributory factor. And if you look again, tracing back Labour's longer history, the role that a sort of municipal socialism had in the building up of Labour support in those areas in the first place. And really since the Thatcher years, it's become, you know, the attacks on local government have made that so much more difficult. So that's not really a direct answer, but I think that is part of the longer term perspective, that has become so much more challenging.
Thank you, Kevin. And again, really good question from Marcus, and I couldn't agree more. If we look at Labour local councils like Preston, who are leading the way, it's fantastic to see Labour in local government and being that inspiration for the National Party as well. So long may that continue. And thanks, Marcus, for everything you do as a Labour councillor. Our next question is from Sarah, who asks, what type of policies or sets of policies should Labour offer at the next election? Sue, would you like to answer that first?
Could you repeat it? Sorry, you cut out from me.
Oh, no problem. Sarah asked, what sets of policies should Labour be offering at the next election?
Well, we need to be looking at what we need to do to give people quality of life back, I think, to a large extent. And that comes back to some basics and some things that are broader. So it's going to include things like education that Kate is doing, and health, housing, the areas that, you know, if you're going to have aspiration and a good life, that you're going to need, you know, good, sensible policies that will restore to people a lot of the public services that we've lost under recent Tory governments. And that will include having an economy that will manage that in a green way. I think a green economy is something that's really, really important. And a green economy that provides long-term future and solutions as well, because we know that one of the big issues of our time is climate change and what's going to happen with the environment. I mean, anyone who saw David Attenborough's programme recently will know that actually things are far worse than I think any of us would have predicted, say, 10 years ago. So we have to tackle that. So any policies we have, I think, have to be set within the green agenda, if you like, within that green economy. So that housing policies have to make sure that new housing is built to high standards and high levels of environmental standards. Exactly the opposite of what the new government planning is doing. And we need to have holistic policies. One of the things that I was keen to do when I was in the Shadow Cabinet was to work across the department, so that any policy I created had input from the other departments, because you can't just sit in isolation as we do in government. So, for example, when we are looking at our environment policies, you have to have housing into that, you have to have transport into it, you have to have, you know, education into that. It all has to come together. So I would hope that we would have policies that undid a lot of the damage that cutbacks to local government has done, cutbacks to public services has done, that restores public services, gives people hope and aspiration, but does it within that green context, and actually is done holistically, so that we are shown to be talking to each other within the party and cross departments. Because I don't think people understand why government doesn't work like that, why we are so separate and so we fight over pockets of money. You know, housing wants this money, which means that education can't have that. It's a ridiculous way to go about it. So I would like to see a really green, holistic committee, if that's possible.
Thank you, Sue. Kate and Kevin, I'm hoping to get one more question in before we end. So if you could just keep your next questions as brief as possible, that'd be great.
So.
Kate, you're on mute.
I'd just say that at this stage in the Parliament, we don't want to have too many detailed policies for the next general election, partly because if they're good, the Tories will nick them, or they'll say they're too expensive and we're profligate with public money, or they'll be out of date by 2024 because everything's so uncertain and changing so fast anyway. But I do think people need to have a sense of our values, of the things that we consider important. And I think we need, as Sue says, to convey our commitment to economic justice, to social justice, but also to our concern for the planet and to climate justice. And so I think setting out the kind of priorities, the kind of values and the kind of commitments that we want to make now or soon is important. But detailed policies, I would not expect Labour to be getting into that now when we are quite a long way out from the next general election.
Thanks, Kate. Kevin?
Completely agree with that. The issue of values, I mean, some of the things like housing and transport and so on, what are they going to look like in 3 or 4 years' time? Actually, some of the things that were seen as being rather radical, like rethinking the nature of work, we're having to do that anyway. So I think, in a sense, there are going to be opportunities to think how our values can translate into a more, you know, certainly a more credible agenda than we're likely to have from the Conservatives. So I completely agree with that point, and it's going to be so crucial. Not just Labour hasn't, I mean, it's obviously the key thing, form Labour governments, but also Labour oppositions in times like we are now. The way of it, the pressure that needs to be exercised is just as important. So I totally agree. Values probably at this stage are more important than the detail of the policies in a few years' time.
Thanks, Kevin. And Kate, I'm going to ask this next question to you. It is from Angela, who asks, I'm from Liverpool and I've lived in Carlisle for many years. We have been Conservative since 2010 and I would like nothing better to see Labour back in power. But what about the northwest seaside towns? They are all Tory now. I see the likes of Morecambe, Blackpool, etc. needing so much help to rebuild and regenerate. Labour won't forget about them, will they?
That is such a good question, and we lost so many good colleagues over the last few elections from those towns. I was particularly heartbroken to lose Gordon Marsden from Blackpool. He was my roommate here in Westminster until the election last December. And I just don't believe the voters in Blackpool are anything like as well served by Conservative governments and Conservative MPs as they were by principled, hardworking Labour MPs like Gordon or MPs like Sue. And I think the people of Workington have lost a great MP in Sue too. And we miss her very much as a colleague. I'm glad she's coming back to the Lords. So we have to be serious about this. We have to actually be investing in electoral energy, you know, campaigning energy and resource in those towns, those seaside towns, but we also need to be serious about the policy offers that we make for people who live there. Any policies that we are developing that actually will change and transform lives in those seaside towns in ways that matter to the residents of those towns. And the first step to being able to do that is for us to be out and about in those towns, hearing what's important to people.
Thanks, Kate. Sue?
Well, obviously, I'm on a mission to make sure we don't get forgotten in the northwest coastal towns. But absolutely, I mean, you know, Kate's absolutely right. I mean, we've lost some very, very good MPs from the northwest. And I think, I mean, it comes back to what I said at the beginning. I mean, this has been going on for a long, long time. And many of those towns just felt forgotten and abandoned and thought that, you know, nobody cared about them. And then I think the other problem we've had is then because of Brexit, I think there's been a certain amount of lack of trust. Labour has lost trust in those towns to a certain extent. And we have to look at how we get that that trust back, so that they can see that we genuinely do want to work to make those places better places to live, places where they want to bring their children up, places with, you know, real aspiration and a future. So it's really important that when we do develop our policies, when we look at our values, that we make sure that we understand what those kind of areas are looking for, what they need, and how we bring pride back, because a big amount of this is actually about loss of pride.
Thank you, Sue. Kevin?
Yeah, I mean, I would only add to the comment that it's going to be, I forget now who raised the point earlier. Kate, I think in terms of the way that the Tories are going to target on these seats that they have won and they want to keep hold of. And I think there is, I don't know, so this would be my final comment. Labour over decades has sort of responded to the last election, almost a bit like people responding to the Versailles, you know, after the First World War, they think of how to avoid that war happening again, but they don't avoid the next war that happens instead. And I think, you know, and people have talked about Labour's northern discomfort, Labour's southern discomfort, and so on. And I do think there is a serious danger that we end up setting one part of the country, one part of the population against another, and that the whole challenge for Labour and the whole vision that Labour has is actually how their interests aren't conflicting and how we need to reconcile those and bring them together. And to me, that's what feels like the real danger and challenge, is that the Conservatives will be working that territory. They'll be doing it in ways that we would all be, some of them would be quite repelled by. And that actually we need to have a vision for those communities that also goes beyond the communities, that is a vision, you know, for the entire country. You know, we talked about somewhere like Scotland. There's another, you know, bastions of Labour that have been lost completely. So however we think about nation and nationalism, has to be in some way that Labour doesn't disappear completely from Scotland and so on. So that's why I said I think it's politically probably more challenging than any predicament Labour has had in decades, to try how you can square the two.
Thank you, and that's all the time we've got. I'd like to thank Kevin, Sue and Kate for joining us. It's been a brilliant discussion, and I hope everyone that's tuned in has enjoyed it. To people that didn't get their questions answered, as the North West Young Fabians, I'm very keen not to disenfranchise anyone, so I'm sure the panel will be happy to email those questions to the panel. There was just a couple of questions, so if the panel are happy to answer those questions, that would be great, and I will get that back to you. Thanks everyone for joining. One last little plug is, if we do have anyone in the Northwest under the age of 31, it'd be brilliant to see you join the North West Young Fabians and hopefully rebuild the Red Wall, because that's what we're all here for, and we want to see a Labour Party in government. So thanks everyone for joining, and look forward to hearing from you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.